Further amendments? Yes, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order and thank the gentlelady from Wisconsin for filling in when I was gone.
Without objection, the gentleman's amendment will be considered as read. The chair notes a reservation of a point of order by the gentlelady from Colorado, and I now recognize the gentleman from Texas to explain his amendment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just for a point of clarification, this is Burgess 031. With this bill, before the underlying bill, the base bill, we're going to give the FDA broad and almost limitless authority and discretion in their ability to regulate tobacco products for the protection of public health. Currently, there are some provisions in the bill that would limit the FDA's authority, and one that really concerns me the most is the one that would prohibit the FDA from requiring the manufacturer produce a cigarette that contains 0 milligrams of nicotine. My amendment proposes to strike subparagraph B in Section 907D3 of the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act as added by Section 101B3 of H.R. 1256, and then give the FDA the power to require the reduction of nicotine levels to 0 in products. If the purpose of this bill is to reduce the harmful effects of this inherently dangerous product, then why not allow the FDA to scientifically analyze whether nicotine should be reduced and if that reduction should be in fact reduced to 0 milligrams of nicotine? It's illogical to handicap them, and that's why I'm introducing this amendment. I would note that when we did our the recent reauthorization of the Consumer Protection Act last year, we required reduction of lead levels down to numbers that were actually unmeasurable by current technology. I don't think it's unrealistic to ask that nicotine, we at least give the FDA the authority to regulate nicotine down to a 0 milligram level. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
The gentlelady from Colorado withdraws her reservation. Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand what Mr. Burgess is trying to accomplish, but I think it's not a good idea, essentially because if the FDA were to essentially ban nicotine or say that nicotine could not be part of cigarettes, it would be tantamount to an outright ban on cigarettes. And to me, it's almost like the prohibition situation. You know, we went through prohibition with alcohol. You ended up with a legal black market, if you will, with alcohol, and I think the same thing would happen with cigarettes. There would become a black market with cigarettes that obviously had nicotine, and we'd have to deal with that whole illicit cigarette manufacturing and chain of events. So I think that wisely what we're doing in the underlying bill is saying that that decision about an outright ban on nicotine is left to Congress, but we allow EPA to lower the levels of nicotine to a level that would be appropriate for the protection of the public health. I mean, I think it's a political decision more than anything else in this case, but I think it's a political decision that makes sense, and that's why I would oppose Mr. Burgess's amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
And again, I know we went through this when we heard this bill the last time, but this is such an important point. We have said that we want the FDA as the premier federal agency regulating involved in regulation that has a basis in sound science. We want them to be at the forefront of this regulation. And then we have language in the bill that says because of the importance of a decision of the Secretary to issue a regulation requiring the reduction of nicotine yields of a tobacco product to 0, the Secretary is prohibited from taking such action under this Act. But what if their science leads them in the direction that lower nicotine levels are in fact beneficial for public health and that the lowest nicotine level really should be 0? The Secretary, their hands are tied and they cannot go to that level.
Well, if I could reclaim my time, I mean, this is essentially what I was saying. You know, you're a doctor, and I respect that you're looking at this from a scientific point of view, and I don't disagree that the science may very well say that no nicotine makes sense. But again, you know, this is a political decision. The FDA is not a political body. That's our job. And I think that the fear is that if you do that, or if the FDA decided to do that for scientific reasons, it would be tantamount to prohibition. And we know what happened. I mean, you know, I don't have to go through American history. It was an utter failure. And if anything, it encouraged people to drink more because it was, you know, because now it was illegal and they could buy it on the black market and encourage all kinds of organized crime and the whole thing. That's a political decision, in my opinion, and I think that we're making that here, and I think it's a wise one based on the fact that if you just outright do a prohibition, you'd get all those negative consequences.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back the balance of its time. Further discussion? Mr. Barton?
I just want to ask some questions of the council. Under the bill, the base bill, could the FDA, without coming back to Congress, set a level that for all intents and purposes was equivalent to zero nicotine?
I'm sorry, sir, I'm not sure if I understand. With the amendment in or
No,
under
sir.
the
As
base
the bill is currently configured, absent the Burgess amendment, could the FDA set a standard for nicotine that, while it allowed some minute level, some de minimis level, 0.0001 something, have the effect of having a zero nicotine cigarette?
As I read the language, sir, it would prohibit the FDA from actually the Secretary from requiring it to be absolutely zero.
But they could come very, very close.
Yes,
They could,
sir.
for all intents and purposes, set a standard
Yes, sir.
that was a zero.
Well,
It wouldn't be zero.
it would not be zero as long as it's a
.0000001.
number greater than zero. The language as it stands prohibits reducing to zero.
Okay.
It does not prohibit to any positive number above zero.
Okay, now I want to ask the author of the bill a question. I would assume that would be the chairman. What is the chairman's take if the FDA set a standard very, very, very close to zero, but which was not zero mathematically? Does the chairman think that is the same effect as a zero standard?
I don't know the answer to that. I think the FDA would have to not just look at how greatly the nicotine could be reduced, but what the consequences would be of reducing it to a low amount. Somebody earlier in the debate said people might start smoking more cigarettes to make up for the drop in nicotine. Well, I would hope the FDA would evaluate that before it made a decision. But we leave the determination to the FDA, and these questions we hope would be answered by review of the evidence and the science.
Okay. Well, the reason I asked the council the question, asked the chairman, who's the author of the bill, the question, the Burgess Amendment is the anti-hypocrisy amendment. Either the bill should give the FDA the authority to regulate nicotine, which it does, but not to eliminate it, and so put some level, minimal level, that people who choose to smoke get some nicotine value, benefit, whatever from it, or we ought to adopt the Burgess Amendment and say if they want to go to zero, they can go to zero. Because if you, apparently where we have the bill is, it's very hypocritical. They can go real close to zero, which so there's no real impact from the nicotine, but they can't go mathematically to zero. And I think that's you either go one way or the other. You either give them the authority to go all the way or set some minimal level beyond which they can't go. And we're not doing that. So
Gentleman, yield.
I'd be happy to yield.
Well, the bill leaves it to the FDA to do what's appropriate for the protection of the public health. And we leave them to do that. But I'm very hesitant to have them ban cigarettes or remove all nicotine and let them come back to Congress if they reach a determination that it's appropriate to protect the public health beyond that. But I don't think it's hypocritical to let them have the decision and not let them go all the way to ban a cigarette.
Well, reclaiming my time, that's all, what we have here is almost a dictionary definition of hypocrisy, because you achieve the consequence without taking the consequences politically of what it is that you achieve, which to me that is hypocrisy.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure, be happy.
You know, I think that the chairman here in this legislation is recognizing the reality. I mean, some of this is science, and that's what the FDA is looking at, and some of this is, you know, us as legislators trying to figure out what works. And, you know, from my perspective, part of the success of getting people to reduce tobacco consumption is that it's starting to look bad. Like, you know, kids, if they think they can't smoke in a school or a public place, and the people. Mr. Chairman, could I ask for an additional minute?
I would ask unanimous consent that I be given an additional minute.
Okay.
So I can yield to my distinguished subcommittee chairman.
And you know, you don't want to get to the point where you just have an outright ban, because we know that historically, if you have an outright ban, you have this illicit market, and sometimes it almost becomes something positive because people know it's illegal, and so now they're going to do it. I mean, I think that those kinds of decisions are really left to the legislature, not to the scientists at the FDA, and I think that's, you know, what really is sort of underlying this decision. Now, it's not perfect as to, you know, where that spectrum meets the total ban, and it may very well be that we have to come back and look at it again if the FDA decides that they want to come close to zero. But there's got to be a recognition here that we as legislators have some role in this, not purely a scientific decision. And, you know, when you decide to just ban something outright, you've got to think about the impact practically. And I think we're in a better position, dare I say, to look at that sort of practical aspect of it and leave the scientific aspect to the FDA.
Well, reclaiming my 5 seconds, there is growing scientific evidence that it's not the nicotine itself that's a health hazard. Nicotine is addictive, but the health hazard is the particulate matter in the smoke and all of that that transmits the nicotine. So if you do a pure health hazard, apparently you can absorb a lot of nicotine without it itself being harmful to health. And I support the Burgess amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are we ready for the question?
Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
gentleman from Indiana.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm from Indiana, and I have the 8th largest tobacco growing district in the country, which most people don't know. And I was very much involved in drafting this language because the previous language was such that it would essentially allow the FDA to go to zero, in my view. I would rather see some kind of percentage in here, but this is the best I could get by with. The question I have, though, is for staff, and maybe they can answer this question. I've looked through most of this bill, but not all of it, and I'm at the part right now looking at it where it talks about requiring the reduction of nicotine yields of tobacco products to zero. The Secretary is prohibited from taking such actions like that. When they determine what that percentage is going to be, is there a time period that is established in this bill when that is to be actually put into practice?
To do so, as I understand it, would require regulation, and regulations under the Administrative Procedures Act, under normal terms, would have at least a 90-day notice period for regulation.
So if there's a 90-day notice and we know exactly when it's going to be, it could always come back to Congress because we're the regulating body over the FDA. That we could change that law, is my understanding. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I believe you're correct.
So I guess the scenario could come to pass that the FDA would try to take it down to near zero, but there is some legislative oversight to prevent that from happening if it, in effect, takes tobacco off the market. And so, therefore, I think that while it's not the best language that I would like to have, it at least is language that I can live with, and I think we do have a recourse if FDA goes too far. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion. Gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from Texas for concluding comments.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. Just on that last point, tobacco, cigarettes, as we all know them, are the delivery device for nicotine. There is no good reason to pull tobacco smoke into your lung unless it is to satisfy the addiction to nicotine. Removing nicotine from a cigarette as a delivery device would do more to eliminate the problem of smoking than almost any single effort that we can undertake. So if our true goal is to limit the public health exposure to cigarette smoke, we would eliminate the addictive component of cigarette smoke, so we would not drive that behavior. Anyone who's watched someone train themselves to smoke, and you do have to do that, it's a very unpleasant process to go through initially because cigarette smoke is so noxious. But the reward is the nicotine that satisfies then the craving for the nicotine addiction after it occurs. And this, I think, is something that likely cigarette companies have understood for some time. My submission is that if we really want to get at the bottom of the public health issue, we will allow the FDA to allow a 0 milligram nicotine cigarette to be produced, and as a consequence, that cigarette would not satisfy the nicotine craving, and cigarette consumption would go down. Now, if our goal is to simply collect more taxes from the tobacco companies, then please, let's be honest about what we're doing and recognize that we're satisfying our addiction to tax dollars, not trying to impact public health. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are we ready for the question? The the amendment before us is offered by the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment's not agreed to.
Can I ask that this be added to the list of votes that will be taken when the time is deemed as appropriate? I would like a roll call vote on this.
Okay. Well, the gentleman is requesting that he have a roll call vote and it be deferred to the time when we take other roll call votes, and without objection, that'll be the order.